Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 95 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The city upon a hill, the Athens of America, the Cradle of Liberty, the City of Champions, Beantown, the Hub. All of these names describe the city of my birth and my hometown, Boston. But how did Boston come to be? Why did the Puritans who sailed from Boston, England in 1630 decide to settle in Massachusetts Bay on the Shawmut Peninsula? And what were their early days like? Today we explore answers to those questions by exploring the history of two Bostons during the 17th century with Rose Doherty, president of the Partnership of Historic Bostons. During our conversation, Rose reveals details about Boston, England in 1630, the Puritans' migration experience and what they brought with them to Massachusetts, and how Boston, England and Boston, Massachusetts became sister cities, and what it means to have a sister city. But first, I realized when editing this episode that Rose and I mentioned something called the Shawmut Peninsula a lot, but we never really described it for you. The Shawmut Peninsula is where Boston is today, only it looks different today because in Boston, we like to make land. I've included a map for you on the show notes page, which is a quick click away on your free Ben Franklin's World app. However, if you can't access the show notes right away, the best thing to do is to look at the back of your left hand. If you close your four fingers together and let your thumb stick out, you will have an approximation of what the Shawmut Peninsula looked like before we made all that extra land. The gap between your thumb and forefinger, that would be where Boston Harbor is. And your wrist and arm, that represents the old Boston Neck, the thin strip of land that connected Boston with the mainland. To the top of your four fingers would be Charlestown, and across the river, which is on the left side of your hand and arm, that would be Cambridge. Hopefully this bit of physical geography will help you out as we discuss the history of Boston's settlement. Ready to explore the history of the two Bostons? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest has been a member of the Partnership of Historic Bostons since 2004. Presently, she serves as its president, and in that capacity, she joins us to discuss Boston, England, and Boston, New England during the 17th century. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Rose Doherty.
Thank you, Liz. I'm really looking forward to telling people about essentially the forgotten history of the two Boston in the 17th century.
And we're really excited to have you tell us about those histories because we know that many of the original inhabitants of Boston, Massachusetts migrated from Boston, England in 1630. But we don't really know a lot about Boston, England. So would you tell us about it? Where is the city located and what did it look like in 1630?
The city is about 100 miles north of London, and it's on the prime meridian. And in 1630, there were about 3,500 people in the town. They lived in two-story houses that were timber-framed with wattle and daub in between, with thatched roofs. And there were a few brick stone medieval buildings left over. There was a large marketplace with the usual punishments available, such as the pillory and stocks and whipping post and ducking stool. And it was also the marketplace once a week. The river at that point was actually still navigable all the way up to St. Botolph's, which is the parish church. And it was, in fact, a small town where people did the kinds of things that you would expect in a small town, a very class society with a professional class of lawyers and ministers, specialized trades, apothecaries and bakers and blacksmiths and brickmakers and millers and some shopkeepers who would sell greengrocers, that kind of thing. And because it was on a river and because they had some trade, you had sail makers and rope makers and you had farmers and laborers also.
Boston sounds like a pretty typical 17th century English town.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. And just like Boston, Massachusetts, Boston, Lincolnshire was surrounded by fens. So one of the trades was hunting the wild foul in the fens. And one of the things that Charles I tried to do was drain the fens and put all of those people who made their living hunting ducks and things like that out of business. It was violently resisted by the people. They didn't want to have anything to do with that.
Now, we also know that many of the original inhabitants of Boston, Massachusetts were Puritans. Would you tell us about the Puritan faith?
The Puritan faith came about after the change from the Roman Catholic Church to the Church of England. And the Church of England essentially maintained the sacraments and the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. The one difference was that there was a king at the head, not the Pope. And one of my friends from Boston, Lincolnshire, says that Henry VIII probably died thinking that he was a Roman Catholic. So you have the Church of England continuing the practices of the Catholic Church. This did not sit well with a lot of people. There was a college in Cambridge that actually taught the Puritan faith. And by Puritan, what is meant is that people wanted to purify the Roman Catholic Church and get rid of all of those practices, those statues, the stained glass windows, the vestments. Oh, that was a big, big thing. They also wanted to have the congregation appointing the vicar for each church or the priest for each church, not the bishops. And so they really did want to purify this town. And Boston was a hotbed for the Puritan faith because, fortunately for the Puritans, the Bishop of Lincoln had Puritan leanings, and he did not bother the people in St. Botolph's church at all about their getting rid of vestments and their getting rid of sacraments and so forth. So it really was the hotbed of Puritan thought, led by a man named John Cotton, who would later come to Boston, Massachusetts.
Puritanism wasn't a mainstream religious faith in England. So, did the Puritans of Boston, Lincolnshire, meet with any discrimination from their fellow Englishmen and women?
In East Anglia, which is where Lincolnshire and Boston are located, there was not a lot of resistance to Puritan thought. In fact, people liked it very much because it got rid of those papish practices. However, in the rest of England, and especially in London with the Archbishop of Canterbury, they were not at all pleased with how things were going. They did not like the way that the Puritans were getting rid of the rituals of the Church of England. So they did meet with a lot of discrimination from the government, from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and in fact it made life in Boston not very comfortable for people because when the Archbishop of Canterbury said, "You will come back to the Church of England and do things the way we want to," he essentially hounded John Cotton, I just mentioned, out of his pulpit. He had to go into hiding. It really was a persecution, may be too strong a word, but it certainly was a time when it was not a comfortable thing to be a Puritan in England.
It does really sound like the Puritans were in an uncomfortable situation. Was this discrimination why so many Puritans left Boston, Lincolnshire for what would become Boston, Massachusetts?
Exactly the reason that they left Boston, England for New England, where they believed that they would be able to set up a holy commonwealth that would allow them to practice their faith the way that they wanted to practice it.
Let's say we're Puritans living in Boston, Lincolnshire in 1630. We're uncomfortable with the present religious climate in England, so we decide we want to migrate to North America and establish a new Puritan commonwealth there. What is the process like for us to migrate? Do we need paperwork? Do we need to purchase land before we go? How do we get to North America?
One of the first things is that one has to get the government to agree that we can all get on ships and go to New England because the land in New England is owned by the Crown. So the first thing that has to be done is that a charter has to be received and signed by the king, by Charles I, to what is then called the Massachusetts Bay Company, giving them the right to go to New England and found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So once that charter is actually received, then people would start to put their affairs in order. They would think about how they were going to get to Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they essentially knew that the chances of their going back home again were slight. So they sold their goods. They made the arrangements to leave, and they also had to bring everything with them. There was a Massachusetts Bay colony in Salem, and one of the ministers there told people that before you come, be careful to bring all of the things that you need, because once you're parted with England, you won't have any taverns or alehouses or butchers or grocers or apothecaries or shops or anything. So bring everything with you. And what the Reverend Francis Higginson did was he actually put together a list of things that they had to bring with them, which was extremely helpful and helped them get through that very hard first year.
Migration sounds like quite the adventure. You've basically told us that everything we know about society as it exists in England won't exist in Massachusetts. So it sounds like migrants had to be really hardy and devout to go to North America.
You really did have to be hardy, and Longfellow would describe the land in New England as wilderness. And for people living in a town that has the largest parish church in the entire country, has many classes of society, has artisans, has groups of people that can provide you with everything you need to have a comfortable life. A lot of these people were fairly sophisticated, extremely well educated. The upper classes had all gone to Cambridge. So they were really well read. They knew what they were doing. They were professionals. They were artisans, and they were going to a place where none of this existed. So when Francis Higginson told them what to bring, he told them about food and suggested that they bring a gallon of aqua vitae, hard liquor, and vinegar and oatmeal. Also, he told them the kinds of apparel they had to bring with them and the amount of cloth they had to bring in order to make a bed. He gave them the list of arms they would need, the tools they would need, the household implements, and also what kinds of domestic animals they ought to bring with them.
Earlier, you mentioned something called the Massachusetts Bay Company. Would you tell us what that company was and what role it played in establishing this new Puritan colony in Massachusetts Bay?
The Massachusetts Bay Company was just that, a company. It had stockholders, and most of the stockholders stayed in England and expected a return from their investment in the Massachusetts Bay Company. The 600 people who came on the Winthrop fleet in 1630 were going to be colonists, so that they quickly changed the Massachusetts Bay Company to Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they did return codfish and timber and things that could be used by people in England. So it quickly became the Massachusetts Bay Colony in everyone's mind, but the charter was for the Massachusetts Bay Company. And that's what the king did. He gave charters for companies. He had one for a trading company at Wessagusset, in what is now Braintree, Massachusetts. That one failed, and others failed, but Massachusetts Bay Colony succeeded.
I have to know, how much profit did stockholders in the Massachusetts Bay Company expect to make? Because I live in New England, and I can tell you that our winters are long, our summers are hot, humid, and short, and our soil is rocky. I also know, which investors likely didn't know, that New England has no cash crops. So, bearing in mind that there were earlier colonies in Massachusetts that would have reported at least some of this information back to England, how much did investors hope to profit?
They hoped that Massachusetts would fish and salt cod and send the salt cod back, and they did that. They also knew that there were virgin forests, and they could send that back. So the Massachusetts Bay Company investors did receive some money. The largest investor was a man named Isaac Johnson, and he was married to the only titled person in the Winthrop fleet, Lady Arbella Johnson, and he was much beloved of the colonists because he actually put his actions where his words were. He came to the colony to help make it succeed.
Okay, so investors never viewed Massachusetts as the land full of gold, furs, or other goods that, say, the Dutch West India Company or the Virginia Company hoped to find in North America. It seems like investors were a bit more realistic or cognizant of the resources that New England actually contained.
They were a bit more realistic. However, Francis Higginson, whose words I've already quoted about be aware that you won't have any taverns or any place to go, Francis Higginson also said that a sup of New England air is worth a draught of Old England's ale. What a wonderful salesperson. I mean, he said this is a great place to come. It's healthy and it will give you a great life. That wasn't actually the truth because we do have rocky soil because we were entering the Little Ice Age. It was cold here and the crops that grew in England would not grow here. So there were a lot of difficulties in surviving those first few years.
Now that we know why some of the people from Boston migrated to North America, we'd like to know who migrated to North America. Would you tell us about some of the Bostonians who left for Massachusetts in April 1630?
I will begin with the most important person to the whole operation was John Winthrop, a lawyer who was the leader of what has become known as the Winthrop Fleet. He organized people, he made sure that they had everything that they needed to make this journey, and at some point during the journey, he delivered a lay sermon, which is known as the City on the Hill sermon. This model of Christian charity told people what they needed to do in order to make the colony a success. He said that you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. And everyone listening to him would have known that that phrase came from the Sermon on the Mount and is followed by a phrase about a man who lights a candle does not put it under a bushel basket. What he was saying was that this colony is being set up to show the Protestant world how to have a truly Christian community. And he was telling people that they were going to be the leaders of this Christian community and they could not afford to fail. Other people who came along were other professionals like Thomas Dudley and Isaac Johnson with his wife, Lady Arbella. And there were, importantly, many families. And this is a difference from the colony in Virginia. In Virginia, men came over. In Massachusetts, whole families came. And that made the colony much more stable from its very beginning. Women and children were part of this Winthrop fleet.
Many professional men migrated to Massachusetts, but I have a hard time seeing John Winthrop, who you noted was a lawyer, or other professional men like him practicing their professions in Massachusetts when land needed to be cleared and new farms and homesteads established. This was backbreaking manual labor. So how successful were these new migrants, these professionals, at establishing a new society in Massachusetts?
People of John Winthrop's level of society came with servants. He came with 8 servants. He had people to do all of the work so that he could concentrate on making the organization of the colony work. And he didn't have to worry about working in the rocky soil, but he did make sure that when they recognized that the rocky soil of the Shawmut Peninsula was not going to be great, he made sure that land in Weymouth, for example, was actually parceled out for farmland that was much better than the land on the Shawmut Peninsula. Just as the society in England had a class structure, the society in Boston also had a class structure. They began by trying to farm the land in common. That didn't work too well. So after a couple of years, people like John Winthrop and other people of his class made sure that the land was parceled out, and about half of the land went to the gentry, to the people who had servants to actually farm it. And the land on the Shawmut Peninsula was actually divided into house lots, and those house lots had kitchen gardens that people could use to grow some of the food that they would eat.
Earlier, you mentioned the Winthrop fleet. That fleet consisted of 11 ships, and English Bostonians used those ships to make their way across the Atlantic Ocean. What was their transatlantic passage like? Do we know how long it took, and what living conditions were like on board those ships?
They left in April and they arrived in Salem in June. We actually have the map of the trip itself. We know what it looked like. Living conditions on board were primitive, to say the least. There were ships that had just baggage and the farm animals that they were bringing with them, and then there were the ships for the people. Obviously no sanitation. Cooking was an issue. It was a long and arduous trip. And when they arrived here, they went to Salem first, the New Jerusalem, and they arrived in June, strawberry season. And Winthrop was so thrilled that his first meal with these wonderful strawberries, it was terrific. However, they also, Thomas Dudley, who would become the assistant governor, realized that Salem only had about 2 weeks worth of food. And it was the beginning of the planting season, but it was still touch and go, and a lot of people were extremely ill. And while in Salem, Lady Arbella died and is in fact buried in Salem.
June is certainly a great time to be in New England, and it sounds like the Bostonians made the most of it. But how did they react to their new home as they moved onto the Shawmut Peninsula? And why did they choose to settle on the Shawmut Peninsula?
Well, when they were in Salem, there was disease in Salem. Lady Arbella died. A lot of the people in Salem wanted to go back to England, so they got onto the Winthrop fleet so that they could go back home. Because there was not enough food in Salem, the Winthrop fleet sailed down to Charlestown, which is on the Charles River right across from Boston, and they settled there for a while. We have the foundations of Winthrop's house, but there was a problem with Charlestown, too. And the problem was the water, which was not good. So they were going to have to leave Charlestown. Now, summer is going on. So in August, they came over to the Shawmut Peninsula at the invitation of a man named William Blackstone, who had gone to Emmanuel College at Cambridge with Sir Isaac Johnson. And at that point, William Blackstone was the only white man living on the Shawmut Peninsula. He had been at Wessagusset, the company I mentioned earlier. He had been there as their minister, and when that company failed and they all went back to England, Blackstone moved to the Shawmut Peninsula, where he had clean water. And what he did was invite the Puritans to come over to the Shawmut Peninsula. And so they arrived at the Shawmut Peninsula at the end of the planting season, but they now had clean water, and they would make the Shawmut Peninsula into the town, Boston, and the beginning of what we know as today's Boston.
And just as an aside here, William Blackstone is a really important figure to the city of Boston because not only did he invite the Puritans to settle on the Shawmut Peninsula, he also gave them the land that we now know and use as Boston Common.
William Blackstone was, in fact, a solitary man. He was a hermit. He was happy living on the slope of Beacon Hill with his books. He had a huge library, and he had some apple trees and had enough to eat. He is extremely important. But when he lived with the Puritans for a while, again, this is a solitary man, a hermit, he was not happy living with all of these families around him. And he is supposed to have said, "I left England to get away from my Lord's bishop. I'm leaving Boston to get away from my Lord's brethren." That's an anecdote that we have no proof of that, but it is, in fact, I think, quite true. He left Boston, and the Puritans, again, because they were very, very smart, they actually had him sign away the 34 acres of the Boston Common. Now, did he actually own it? No, he didn't. But they did not want him to come back at some point and say, "Wait a minute, that's my land that you're using." So they had him sign the deed for the Boston Common, which became a very important place for grazing cows and for militia and for punishment to the town. So Blackstone is extremely important. He went off to Rhode Island, and we now have Massachusetts. We have the Blackstone River. We have the Blackstone Valley. He is an important man to the city's history.
At Blackstone's invitation, John Winthrop and his Puritans moved to the Shawmut Peninsula, and they established a settlement, a town. How did they decide to name their new settlement Boston?
The Shawmut Peninsula, the Shawmut is the Indian name for the land. The French called it Trimontaine because from the ocean you could see three hills. And when the Puritans came to Boston and started to set up their meeting house and their government for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they decided that they would name it for the town that many of them had come from. Boston would, during those first years, would give up about 10% of its population. But 10% did not come on the Winthrop fleet, but they came in the years following. So it was a very important town. Also, on the day that the decision was made to call the town Boston, the people who were part of the general court at that point were largely from Boston. People from other towns were actually absent.
And New Englanders had that habit, right? People migrated to North America from all over England, and these migrants named their new North American towns after the English towns they left behind. And later, their descendants would migrate all across North America, and they would name towns from New York State to Oregon after their ancestral New England towns.
Absolutely. In fact, it's a wonderful thing to do with grade school children is have them point out the names of the towns in Massachusetts alone that are named after towns in England. It's really quite amazing because just like every immigrant group, people wanted to bring something of home with them. And the name is certainly very important, but it's not the only thing that they brought from home. They also brought their habits of eating. And this is important because the grains that grew in England did not grow here. They tried very hard to grow rye and wheat, and it simply did not do well. And it took them a while to learn to use the Indian corn, and they used it and obviously survived very well on it.
Your mention of the school children's exercise made me recall that when I went to college and took an English history course, every time the professor would say the name of an English town, my brain would go and automatically place that town on my mental map of New England. So it got to be really confusing for me because towns located near each other in England aren't always right next door to each other in New England.
That's exactly what happens. And it is a great revelation to students to see how many of the towns, my own town, which is Needham, is named for Needham Market, England. The town that we broke off from is Dedham, and that is named for an English town. All groups bring as much of their old life as they can with them. That's just the way that human beings react.
In 1999, Boston, England, and Boston, Massachusetts became sister cities. Would you tell us the story of how that happened and what it means for cities to have a sister city?
Sister cities are important for tourism and trade, and the connection that is made is one that the city fathers try to use to promote each city. When the suggestion was made that Boston, Massachusetts should become a sister city to Boston, Lincolnshire, England, the mayor then, Thomas Menino, who would go on to be the longest-serving mayor in the city of Boston, Thomas Menino was approached by a man with the wonderful name John Winthrop Sears. Yes, a direct descendant of John Winthrop. And John Winthrop Sears went to Mayor Menino and said, I want you to make Boston and Boston sister cities. And Mayor Menino said, no, we already have enough sister cities. And John Sears said in his Boston accent, Mayor Tom, you may have many sisters, but you have only one mother. And so Boston, England is a sister city of Boston, Massachusetts now, which I think is just a wonderful story. And then the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, James Swift, signed a proclamation saying that everyone should know the relationship of Massachusetts and especially Boston to Boston, England. And that also was signed in 1999.
Now, the Partnership of Historic Bostons sponsors a lot of activities centered around something called Charter Day. Would you tell us what Charter Day is and about the activities the partnership sponsors?
Each year on September 7th, which is the day on which Boston, Watertown, and Dorchester were named by the Great General Court, it was called just the General Court back then, we commemorate the charter that the Puritans brought from England, and we have a series of events around the commemoration of this event each year. And each year we have a specific theme. Last year it was food and drink, and we ate 17th century food. This year it is going to be called Passionate Puritans, Marriage, Love, and Sex in 17th Century Massachusetts. We do this because we want people to remember that Boston began in 1630. Every American school child knows 1620. Boston school children know 1630. And then we had a revolution. Well, that's over 100 years of history that is not remembered. So we dedicate ourselves to having a commemoration each year. We ring bells in the city, we have tours, we have lectures, and we also do this kind of activity throughout the year. Whenever the streets are passable, we have tours, we have lectures year-round, and we are also now working with Mass Historical Society to bring together people who want to read original documents, and this has been wonderful. We have read John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon. We have read the Constitution for the Commonwealth. We have read the Giles captivity narrative, and these are all people who have never read these documents before because they simply are not talked about in most educational situations. And there is this incredible hunger, so much so that on a recent tour, I had 34 people on the wait list. I thought that was quite amazing. I should also say that it is called Charter Day, and we do have the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company. There is no Boston charter, and I want to make that clear because people do write and say, wait a minute, what is this Boston charter? It was the Massachusetts Bay Company charter, which is the thing that established the Massachusetts colony and eventually the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as we have it today.
Now that we have our knowledge of the charters all straightened out, it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the Boston migrants had not settled in Boston, New England? How would the traditions and settlement of the area we now know as Boston and Massachusetts be different?
If the colonists from England had not come to settle the Boston area, it could very well have remained a bit of a wilderness for a while because 90% of the indigenous people had died because of European diseases. So it was, in fact, sparsely populated, but still populated by the native people. What would have happened to the colonists had they gone elsewhere? Had their charter not been for the Boston area, had it been for, say, the Virginia area? I think things would have been very different for them because in Virginia, there were diseases that simply could not survive a Boston winter, so that people would have been less healthy, I think. They would, however, have brought along their families. They would have created a stable society from the very beginning, no matter where they had been, because they had a single purpose, and the purpose was to create this godly commonwealth, and that would inform all of the things they did. The laws that they eventually got around to codifying in the 1640s, the establishment of watches and the distribution of land and the building of the meeting house, which had 2 sermons a day and 1 lecture day on Thursday. It would have been the same kind of organization, no matter where they had been. The challenges would have been different had it been in a different place because, as I mentioned before, this was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, and we know what our growing season is like now. It is estimated that it was 4 weeks shorter then.
We've heard all about Charter Day on September 7th, but are there any other activities that the Partnership of Historic Bostons has coming up that we should be aware about?
Absolutely. We have a series of events throughout September and October about the passionate Puritans. We are going to have a talk at the Boston Public Library about love and longing, not only carnal longing, but also the longing for God that motivated these people. We're going to meet at the Bellingham House in Chelsea. Governor Bellingham had been the Chief Justice in Boston, England, and he came here, served many times as governor, and his country house was in Chelsea. We have someone coming from Lincolnshire, who is an industrial archaeologist. He is coming to talk about the Boston that Mr. Bellingham left behind. We're also going to have a conversation about three-dimensional Puritans, where we're going to talk about marriage, love, and family at the old State House, and we will have artifacts there. Now, we will also be at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, where the president and CEO will talk about imperiled privilege, the passionate women of Boston's colonial elite. Because like every society, if you are a member of the elite, your punishment for things like indiscretions and affairs and adultery and fornication will not be the same as if you were a laborer or a middle-class person. So we will have a talk about that. We are then going to be at Old South Meeting House, where the Winthrop scholar, Frank Bremer, will talk about ravishing affection. And ravishing affection is a term that John Cotton used to explain how husband and wife, or husband and yokemate, as he described them, should treat each other with ravishing affection. That's not the way that one thinks of the Puritans, is it? One thinks of the term puritanical, meaning having a rather censorious view of sex, and that's not it at all. We will also have tours, and we will have an excellent time, I am sure.
Wow, you have a lot planned, and it sounds like a lot of fun too. Now, where is the best place to look for more information about the Partnership of Historic Bostons, its slate of fun activities, and how we can contact you if we still have questions about Boston, England, and Boston, New England?
You can reach me at historicbostons.org. That is our website, and that has our partnership email on it, phbostons@gmail.com. It also has a link for our Facebook page and for Twitter. And speaking of Facebook, in the last 2 weeks, I've had over 24 people with Boston, England connections join the conversation. And it is really quite amazing. I have no idea who in England put them on to us, but it is really wonderful. So the conversation is with people all over this country, east to west, and then people in England who have Boston connections. And you can also find my phone number there, and I am ready and willing and excited to take questions from people.
Rose Doherty, thank you for joining us and for helping us explore Boston, England and Boston, New England during the 17th century.
Thank you for this opportunity.
It sounds like the Puritans had a pretty good life in Boston, England. They lived in a well-established town with a large parish church, a regular local market, and plenty of well-trained artisans and professionals. Yet, they opted to migrate and leave their comfortable material lives behind because officers of the Church of England made their spiritual lives uncomfortable. And the Puritans thought that they would rather be uncomfortable in their material lives than in their spiritual lives, which is why so many migrated to North America and worked to establish a new godly commonwealth. As Rose noted, the Puritan migrants landed in Salem before they made their way to Charlestown. Like Goldilocks, the Puritans looked for the right place to make their settlement, and they found that just right spot on the Shawmut Peninsula. The peninsula had plenty of fresh water, a large harbor, and land that they could establish both farms and dwelling houses on. Over time, as the settlement became more like a town and less like a farming village, farming moved to other areas on the mainland. That's a broad overview of how Boston, the city upon a hill, the cradle of liberty, and the hub of Massachusetts and New England, got its start. You can find more information about Rose, the Partnership of Historic Bostons, plus a link to all the activities that the partnership has planned on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/095. Did you know that you could listen to Ben Franklin's World through the Ben Franklin's World app? The app contains links to show notes, the books, historic sites, or projects we're discussing. Plus, you can share your favorite episodes with all your friends and followers using easy-to-click social share buttons. Sharing your favorite episodes with friends and followers really helps me out, by the way, because not only does it express your enjoyment of the show, it helps the show find new listeners. The app is free and comes in both iOS and Android versions. For more information, visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps. Finally, what city or town do you call home? And what about its early American past would you like to know more about? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.